Welcome everyone to today's Prepared for Environmental Change webinar hosted by Indiana University's Environmental Resilience Institute. My name is Andrea Webster and I'm so happy to be with you today and to talk about this topic of addressing heat preparedness in under-resourced communities. The Environmental Resilience Institute is starting to work with communities across the state on this exact topic. As we work with local governments, we've learned that they're really focused on flooding. Of course, it's a big topic in Indiana, but they haven't really started thinking about the impact of heat in our communities as that is increasing. And so next week, look for a press release from us. We'll be talking about our Beat the Heat program, but for the time being, we want to hear from two of our speakers today. And to get that process started, I want to first acknowledge and honor the Miamiamik, the Lenape, the Bodewaamik, and the Sawanwa people as past, present, and future caretakers of the lands on which Indiana University is located. These ancestral indigenous homelands and resources are the current home of the Environmental Resilience Institute. We want to encourage everyone to engage with these contemporary communities, to learn the histories of the land, to look at who has and does not have access to its resources, and also to examine your own place, abilities, and obligations with this process of reparative work. So during the webinar today, we'll save questions until the end, but please enter your questions into the chat function throughout the presentation. And in the last few minutes of the webinar, we'll share a feedback survey through a Zoom polls because we want to get your feedback as we head into a new webinar series in the fall. We are recording the webinar today, so I'll share a link of that to that recording along with some follow-up resources, probably early next week. And now I'm very pleased to introduce today's moderator, Gabe Philippelli, who is the director of IU's Environmental Resilience Institute. Gabe?
Well, thank you. Welcome, everybody. And I'm really excited about this particular webinar. I'm excited about all of them, but yeah, I get to see a dear friend and colleague, Dan Johnson, present and a new friend and colleague, Julie, present on their work. Without addressing heat preparedness in an equitable manner, certainly under-resourced communities will be disproportionately burdened by higher temperatures, extreme heat events, and the heat island effect, obviously, which is profound in cities, which has other air quality issues as well. For our speakers today, we're really excited to have Dr. Dan Johnson, who has extensive background in mapping and addressing extreme heat vulnerabilities, including some phenomenal work with NASA on that topic. You'll also hear from Julie Donna, who will talk about the city of Louisville. Sorry, I'm from California. I have a hard time learning how to say Louisville. Anyway, Julie will say it right. Is how that city is equitably addressing heat preparedness. So just as a little bit of a background, in addition to our webinar series, ERI has many other resources that are available to local governments and the general public. One resource that I want to make sure that you all know about is Indiana Environmental Reporter on the bottom of the screen. It's an independent reporting organization, and the mission of IER, as we call it, is to present Indiana residents with information about environmental change and to provide strategies for citizens to prepare for, adapt to, and respond to the impact of environmental change. And this is a phenomenal resource. It's often picked up by local and national newspapers, their reporting, and it's a really valuable aspect of ERI. So as Andrea indicated, for July and August, we'll be on summer break. Our students are in summer break, so it looks like we are too, at least for the webinar. And then we'll return, of course, in September. And we really want to feature new webinar topics that you guys identifies or our audience identifies. And we'll work hard to find experts and interesting speakers who can speak to the topics you bring up. So we hope that you will complete our webinar topic survey and to provide input on the types of webinars that would be of interest. The deadline is July 15th, as you can see, so we can get organized. And the survey doesn't take long, about 5 minutes or so. And you'll see that, the survey link is in the chat now. We also wanted to thank, of course, our hosts. Our sponsors for this, AIM, ACE, Health by Design, and the Indiana Public Health Association, who faithfully supported this webinar series through the year. And thank you everyone for who's attending today's webinar. You'll see a lot of diverse institutions from local, state and local governments to universities to others. So welcome all of you, and this will be, I think, really valuable tools as you go about your own, whether it's your own dealing with your own cities or municipalities, or learning a little bit more about the science that goes behind some of this. So our presenters today are Dr. Dan Johnson. He's an associate professor here at IUPUI in Indianapolis in the Department of Geography. Dr. Johnson's research interests are modeling complex human environmental interactions, and particularly with a focus on environmental health and spatial epidemiological applications. His primary work focuses on vulnerability and intersections with natural and man-made hazards. And Dan was actually on our executive committee for our Center for Urban Health up here at IUPUI for years. Julie Donna serves as Louisville's Metro Government's Sustainability Coordinator. I guess she's all things sustainability in the Office of Advanced Planning and Sustainability, and on the board of directors for Louisville Grows and Louisville Energy Alliance. She's focused on building a low emission, climate resilient Louisville through collaborative and equitable solutions. And her previous experience includes leading projects for the city of Cincinnati's Office of Environment and Sustainability and Green Umbrella, the Regional Sustainability Alliance of Greater Cincinnati that ERI is starting to get involved with as well. So in the speaking order will be Dan, followed by Julie. You can, throughout this webinar, feel free to enter questions through the chat function, or at the very end, we'll address those. And at the very end, we'll also open it up if you want to unmute yourself and ask a question, or raise your hands, and we'll be attentive to the raised hand functions. Both options, of course, you've been on Zoom for a year, so you know where the options are. But regardless, they're down there in the on the bottom controls of your Zoom. So we don't want to hear from me. We want to hear from the experts. So I'm going to turn this over to Dan now. Dan, you've got the show.
Okay, thanks, Gabe. I appreciate that introduction. Let me get this shared and make sure we're on track. Let's see, start the slideshow. There we go. All right, so thanks again. I appreciate that the Environmental Resiliency Institute has invited me to present today, and I thank everyone for attending. I sort of have an offset camera set up here with this, so I apologize for that. But as Gabe said, I've been involved with extreme heat research for almost 20 years. And I've worked with NASA and CDC on a variety of techniques for identifying vulnerable populations and working to mitigate some of the effects. One of the biggest things I think I've witnessed over the last 20 years, and this is a slide I like to show or when I give a presentation on extreme heat, and it had a lot more punch 15 years ago when there wasn't as much awareness of extreme heat as there is today. But here we see Chicago on a typical summer day, right? And I can use the same image and show Chicago during an extreme heat event, right? So it does not have the visible effect that a tornado or hurricane or flooding has. So awareness to extreme heat as a hazard has not been as it hasn't been as widespread as some of the other effects, at least historically. That has changed over the last 10 to 15 years with a lot of community outreach and that sort of thing, pointing to extreme heat. So, but when we talk about extreme heat events, it's important to figure out what it is we're talking about. And there is not a real universal definition for what an extreme heat event might be. So if we went and talked to different health agencies across the country, they would have a different, potentially slightly different, or in some cases, extremely different definition of what an extreme heat event would be. If we talk to the National Weather Service, they're going to have their definition, but that can even vary based on what part of the country we're in. But typically, we're talking about a prolonged period of high ambient air temperatures. And not always, but these are usually accompanied with high humidity. So if we think about an extreme heat event in Phoenix, for example, we're not going to have the high humidity there that we would experience usually in an extreme heat event in, say, Indianapolis or Chicago. So temperatures in Phoenix would have to get much higher without that humidity for heat to be a problem. Also, there's a lot of adaptability in Phoenix. So a lot of people are aware of heat there, where in other parts of the country, not as much. We also know that heat is the #1 cause of weather-related death in North America and most likely the world. Adding to this, heat is probably the least reported as far as across the board. It's the least, or it's the most underreported, would be a better way of saying it, weather-related cause of death and morbidity that we see. Global climate variability can add to different areas experiencing heat in a given year with our oceanic atmospheric interconnections like El Nino and the Arctic Oscillation. We can see areas of the country more prone to extreme heat in a given year. But usually these are most extreme in temperate climates, the Midwest being a temperate climate. So areas where we have fairly cool or cold winters and warm, hot summers is where the effects are typically most pronounced. What are some of the heat health effects? So obviously overheating and heat exhaustion, heat syncope, hyperthermia are the obvious ones. Dehydration, another fairly obvious, but there's a variety of, and we're discovering more and more each day, it seems, of health effects from heat that we might not always expect. So persons with COPD, cardiovascular disease, obviously heat can impact them a great deal. Heat can affect a person's mental health, right? We're seeing that. For some reason, during some extreme urban heat events, we see increases in crime across, in areas where we're experiencing some of the most intense heat. But like I said, there's other health effects that we don't completely understand yet. And I was on a presentation a few weeks ago where we were examining heat's effects on non-compliance for taking hypertension medication. And for some reason, when the temperatures get warm, people tend to stop taking medications. So why that is, we're still trying to uncover it. There's probably some where they've run out of medication and won't go get their medication during hot temperatures. We're still trying to unravel that. Obviously, the urban heat island effect has a big role. And most of you probably heard of this before, and it's a phenomena we've been aware of since the late 1800s. But this is where we've built our urban jungles, right? We've built our concrete metal jungles in cities. And all of those materials we use to build these environments retain heat. And so this makes our built environments typically somewhere, we can be 10, 15 degrees warmer than our surrounding countryside or the surrounding sort of natural background. This is from a project some NASA colleagues of mine worked on several years ago. It's called Project Hotlanta. And this is looking at satellite imagery of Atlanta's urban heat island. And you can obviously see effects, here these brighter reds are hot areas. You can see there's a strong effect between that and what you see up here is these gray and white areas. But also the cooler areas are vegetation rich, as you can see by the darker greens here. So a few years ago, we did an analysis in Indiana this is from, I was trying to remember, it's 2016 or 2017. We had a heat event in Indiana lasting about 4 or 5 days. We collected land surface temperature data, or land surface temperature images from it's called the MODIS satellite from NASA, and did a composite. And so not unexpectedly, we're seeing areas of, Indianapolis highlighted, right? Indianapolis is our, obviously largest city in Indiana. We're seeing some areas up around Gary, New Albany, so starting to get into Louisville, we're seeing that fairly pronounced. But then there are areas across the state that maybe typically wouldn't be considered areas prone for extreme heat. So Richmond, right, Newcastle, Shelbyville, Columbus, right? So Terre Haute, places like that where we're seeing, you know, what we would maybe call in this case micro urban heat islands relative to the large Indianapolis heat island, but areas we might not have expected to be exposed to this, to the heat effects from the built environment. This is Indianapolis from a study several years ago, and we collected an image of the urban heat island right at the height of an extreme heat event. And so what you're seeing here is on these darker reds is temperatures approaching 320 kelvin. So that's about 118 degrees Fahrenheit in areas of the city. Also, but this is, it's very discontinuous, right? The urban heat island effect. It's not one, you know, this, we can go from one area into a very hot area into a fairly cool area without traveling very much distance. So a few years ago on campus, we did at IUPUI, we went outside during an extreme heat event with a thermometer and measured a temperature of 120 degrees above the asphalt on the parking lot. Walked across the street to Military Park and we were down to 95 degrees. So big difference over maybe 30, 40 meters. So we did a study and we're working right now to build the 2020 image of this. So I probably will have it in a few more weeks, right? But looking at the urban heat island effect from 1990 to 2010. So the point from this is that we can see some change. We see changes over time. This is not some static thing that is always present. The big thing or it's always the same. The big thing we see here, so in 1990, you see this area of Indianapolis, but here we're seeing some cooling taking effect, right? And most likely what this is due to is the urban tree canopy has grown in that area. We've probably have, that's caused it. There's been some other types of development there and maybe some urban tree planting has helped this area. But then you're also seeing, if you look at this part of Indianapolis and look at it in 2010, right? And I imagine 2020 is going to show us further increase in this. But we know this exposure to the urban heat island is linked very heavily to extreme heat morbidity and mortality. This is a model that I developed with NASA and the CDC called the Extreme Heat Vulnerability Index. And we ran this for the state of Indiana to look at socioeconomic conditions that are contributable to extreme heat vulnerability and the urban heat island. So some of that type of same imagery I showed you of Indianapolis, of the entire Indiana earlier. And not surprisingly, right, Indianapolis shows up as a major area, but again, we're seeing some of the other locations around the state where we've got small pockets, and maybe if we add we haven't done this analysis yet, but if we add all of those small pockets together, we may have something on the order of higher degrees of vulnerability than what we see in Indianapolis alone. So all those areas are worth looking at. I know the Environmental Resiliency Institute is looking at, or is planning to work soon in Richmond and then down in, I think it's Clarksville in around New Albany. So we also have run this extreme heat vulnerability index model for Indianapolis for those years, for 1990, 2000, and 2010. And what we see from this is a clear change in extreme heat vulnerability throughout those years. So, you know, we see different locations showing up through time. So one thing we know from this by doing finer scale analysis, at least finer temporal ranges, is that the extreme heat vulnerability can change from year to year in a location. So this can be somewhat variable. We're still trying to understand some of the components of that I'll talk about a little bit later, but some of it has to do with what we feel like are some resiliency components present in some of these vulnerable populations. So one of the first heat events I worked on, and this is also one that was probably brought extreme heat into the limelight in the United States, at least one of the initial ones, was the 1993 Philadelphia extreme heat event. And this lasted for 2 weeks in July. It was directly attributed to 213 deaths. And we had a high ambient air temperature of 101 degrees, and relative humidity was 58%. And if we look at temperature and it's associated with extreme heat deaths, after about 10 days here, we have our highest temperature, but we also are at that point hitting our highest level of extreme heat death. Now, that's probably mostly attributed to, we had some of the highest ranges of temperatures in here. We happened to hit our peak on the same day, but usually this death peak occurs a few days after the high temperature peak. But also with this, as you'll notice, are the nighttime air temperatures. The low temperature did not drop much, right? It's still the range between the high and low is about the same. So no one, the people exposed to this are not getting relief from it, essentially. We see some of the same things in Chicago. So Chicago, this was the big event that brought this into the public eye in the United States, was the Chicago 1995 heat event. And what we saw with this is over 700 deaths in about a 5 to 6 day period. And Chicago, there's books written on this. Chicago didn't understand exactly what was going on. The public health officials there didn't understand exactly what was going on. And most of these deaths were elderly people living alone. The study we did with this, we had to collect death certificates out of a basement that had flooded in Springfield, Illinois, and come back and geocode all of these addresses because there's no electronic, they weren't available electronically. So we had to do that by hand. And at these points you see here are where someone died at home. Is what you're seeing. And this is very strongly related to the urban heat island effect. Obviously, there's some that aren't in some of the hotter areas, but by and large, most of them are. Sort of another visualization of it here, just with the sort of the temperatures. So who is vulnerable? Well, elderly living alone, as I just said, with the Chicago heat wave, that's widely considered to be the #1 vulnerable population. And elderly in general, though, are incredibly vulnerable, mostly due to as we age, we start to we start to lack thermoregulation capabilities, and also we start to not realize we're overheating. So kind of those two effects together are compounded. Persons of color, reduced socioeconomic status, but also living coincident to some of these more extreme temperatures related to the urban heat island is also present. Certain chronic medical conditions, obviously COPD, kidney issues. We could list a whole number of chronic medical conditions that make a person more vulnerable. Certain medications, and I'll combine illicit drug users with that because these drugs can affect the ability to thermoregulate, and that can lead to being increasingly vulnerable to the effects of extreme heat, and obviously outdoor workers. So what are some mitigation efforts? So obviously cooling centers, right? Cooling centers is something that health departments open every year. But something we found is that a lot of these cooling centers are not opened relative to where vulnerable populations most need them. So we've done some work in different cities to try to utilize sort of our extreme heat vulnerability index model to target areas where cooling centers should be opened, right? Because a person's not probably going to go out and walk in the heat a mile to get to a cooling center, and you really wouldn't want a person doing that anyway. So these need to be fairly close to where the vulnerable populations are, and also with some sort of network at getting at-risk people to them. Green rooftops and green design. So this helps mitigate the urban heat island effect. but how much of effect this has on our vulnerable populations has yet to be seen, right? Because a lot of this is not in a location coincident with what we would consider a vulnerable population. So here on the top left, you see a green parking lot. We're starting to see some truly green parking lots where parking spaces are actually made of grass and that sort of thing. Here on the right, this is a Walmart. This is a Walmart in Chicago, and I'm working on a study right now with some colleagues of mine at Yale and CUNY in New York to look at the effects of green roofs on extreme heat. But this one's sedum is planted on top of this, on top of the Chicago Walmart. Here you've got another Chicago Walmart. This one's in Portland with more native types of plants. But these are, these do cool the environment, as I said, but again, it does affect the urban heat island, but maybe not so much our vulnerable populations that we're most interested in. This is something that would be targeted reforestation. This was a study a graduate student of mine did a few years ago, looking at social vulnerability and its relationship to tree canopy in a neighborhood in Indianapolis. So the darker reds you see here are areas more socially vulnerable. And you'll see, especially in this area, not much tree canopy here, right? And as some of you are probably aware, you can look up different websites and things for how much air conditioning a certain tree would add to, say, a building if you've planned it strategically. So, but the U.S. Forest Service, as you can see here, estimates this. Oh, went to. Increase the surface albedo. So in the 1980s, the idea was, let's paint all the cities white, right? We'll paint all the cities white, and this will reflect all the incoming heat. Well, we didn't do that, obviously, and it probably wouldn't have looked very pretty either, but I don't know how big of an effect it would have had either. But with fresh asphalt, we have 5% reflectivity, about 123 degrees is the temperature. Aged asphalt, a few years later, it's reflecting 10%, so a little more, 115 degrees. And this example shows a prototype asphalt coating, placing this white prototype coating, which is made of, I'm not sure in this example, but reflects 50%, its temperature is 90. So it would significantly decrease the effect of the urban heat island. Something of interest too is the astroturf fields, the artificial turf fields that a lot of our children play on every year. This time of year, the temperatures are somewhere up in here, the 123, 120 degrees Fahrenheit above a turf field. So directing resources into locations. So here we see a cooling bus, right? This was something we worked on in Philadelphia, was finding the vulnerable neighborhoods and then sending a city bus into that neighborhood with an air conditioner, right? Send people who could come and get on, take enough time to cool off, add water, all this sort of thing. And it did, people seem to like that more than the cooling centers being open. And then we hear it every year now. Be a good neighbor, check on those that are elderly. We know they're living alone, make sure they've got water, make sure they have access to their medications and all that sort of thing. So I would encourage anyone to do that if you have elderly neighbors. So what is it we need in the future? So recent studies have shown us that extreme heat is increasing. We know this, and that we potentially are just at the tip of the iceberg of understanding its overall effects. I mentioned like the non-compliance with medication. That's something unintended. We would not necessarily maybe think of that. So there's a whole variety of I've got more examples of that, but we think this might just be the tip of the iceberg. Awareness of extreme heat has increased significantly over the last decade. I do sort of a survey in my classes ever so often, and 10, 15 years ago, maybe 10, 20% of my students knew extreme heat was a killer. Now it's 60, 70%. So that's some anecdotal evidence there, but we see also some published evidence of this. But we need to do more because there's still many preventable deaths in a given year and in a location. So one thing, and this is areas I'm starting to get involved in, is doing more resiliency analysis to determine which vulnerable communities are also least resilient. And so a lot of people incorrectly think that resiliency and vulnerability are two opposite ends of the spectrum, but there's a little more to it than that. We can see two equally vulnerable communities, but one community being more resilient and rebounds from an effect sooner than this other community. So we're trying to examine what makes it that way, what causes that. So getting to know more of these local scale variations in resiliency and adaptability will help us do more. So, and once we do know more, then we can hopefully do more. So that's the end of my slides. Thank you. Hope I didn't go over. I probably did.
It's very interesting. No, we still have plenty of time for Julie, so I'll share her slides.
Okay, I apologize. I'll stop sharing. There we go.
All right. Thank you, Daniel, for that that presentation. That really, I think, underscores the importance of what we're doing in Louisville and what we are really striving to achieve with mitigating these health impacts and these impacts to our population. So I am Julie Donna. I am the Sustainability Coordinator of Louisville Metro Government. You can call it Louisville, Louisville, and anything you want to call it, as long as you're saying good things about us. So, next slide. Just a little bit about Louisville before we, before I dive into our urban heat strategies and what we've been working on, is that we are a city-county merged government. So in total, Louisville and Jefferson County has a population of about 770,000. And our mayor, Greg Fisher, has declared the values of compassion, health, and lifelong learning. So those really are aspects and values that we insert into all the work that we do. Next slide. Our urban heat management journey in Louisville really began with a study from the Urban Climate Lab at Georgia Institute of Technology, and which looked at 2012 data and determined that our urban heat island effect was growing in Louisville. And this map shows our average daily high temperatures that year in the warm season. And as you can see, we have quite a disparity between some areas of the city, and our urban heat areas can be up to 10 degrees hotter than our more suburban areas in the city. So this was something that we decided we really needed to focus on. Next slide. Also coming out of that study, we saw that Louisville, of the cities that were studied, Louisville is actually the most rapidly warming heat island at the time. That doesn't mean we had the largest urban heat island effect, but just that it was the most rapidly warming. So this really brought people together and said, okay, we need to take action and do something about this. Next slide. But when looking at what we had to do for our urban heat island effect, we had to incorporate equity and really look at the impacts of historical discrimination in Louisville. So if any of you are not familiar with the concept of redlining, and that phenomenon is what is referred to as redlining is when the federally funded homeowners loan corporation, founded in the 1930s from the Green New Deal, was loaning for homeowners. They determined that certain areas were desirable and marked them in green, and then took most of our Black, brown, low income, and immigrant communities and deemed them undesirable, and literally drew red lines around those communities and discriminated against them for funding for homeowner loans. So this effect is still seen today in Louisville, the effect of this discrimination and disinvestment in those areas. And so looking at our urban heat island map again, our West Louisville area really is our Black and brown communities, and the East Louisville area that you can see is not affected by our heat nearly as much is the white area. So the not redlined areas actually present day have 49% on average tree canopy, and our historically redlined areas only have 22% tree canopy. So we've looked at this and determined that we need to incorporate equity into all that we do for mitigating the urban heat island in order to address these inequities, in order to not actively worsen them. Next slide. And of course, I'd be remiss to not talk about climate change as well. So if we continue on our current emissions pathway and continue on business as usual, Louisville's looking at 7 to 12 degrees higher average temperature across the year. And that means that Louisville will, by the late century, feel more like present day Montgomery, Alabama than Louisville, Kentucky. So, so this really underscores the need for climate action and that being a key urban heat management strategy as well. Next slide. So one of our most successful programs to date to mitigate the urban heat island effect is our Cool Roof Rebate Program. It is a program to directly rebate residents for installing a cool roof material on their building, whether it's a commercial or residential building, and they receive $1 per square foot rebate if it's a Energy Star certified cool roof. So this is really beneficial to the residents because the cool roofs actually make their buildings more energy efficient, and then it helps the city to manage its urban heat, and they get some money back in their pockets. So it's really a win-win-win solution. Next slide. But we did not want to distribute these funds equally across the city because of these historic disinvestments and really trying to target our most high heat and high need districts. So we took those areas that are experiencing the highest urban heat and dedicated 70% of our funding for the program to those areas. So to date, we've incentivized the installation of over 800,000 square feet of cool roofs, but the majority of those funds have gone equitably toward those high heat districts where they really are making the most impact and mitigating the heat where it's needed. Next slide. So another program I'll talk about really is our main targeted reforestation program, which is the Green Heart Louisville project. And this is not just a Louisville Metro project, it's actually a huge collaboration between the University of Louisville and their Envirom Institute, our Louisville Rose nonprofit partner, the Nature Conservancy, Louisville Metro government, and a whole host of partners all coming together to work on this huge project. So it is the first controlled experiment to test urban greening, and it is a NIH clinical trial. You can go to clinicaltrials.gov and see that is actually the only NIH certified clinical trial that tests urban greening as the intervention, as a pharmaceutical drug would be tested. So, and this is targeted in a neighborhood, South Louisville, that is high heat, and when this began was very low tree canopy, and really was in need of this targeted reforestation. So not only are the residents getting the benefit from this massive tree planting, but we're actually testing to see the health impacts of the residents before and after this large urban greening to really make evident that it's really beneficial in a whole host of ways to the residents directly in their lives. Next slide. So just to go into a few aspects of what this urban or massive urban greening entails, the greening part is the really the great part where we get to go round door to door and knock on residents' doors and ask if they would like a tree planted on their private property. So it's mainly done by the partner Louisville Grows, and they have actually, they've gone through, and when they first knocked door to door between all the residents, they actually only got about 10% responses of yes to a free tree. And that's surprising to many people. But when you think of just historic distrust in others and various reasons why people may not want a tree, it's actually not quite so surprising. And but eventually, when they did start going in and planting the trees and showing the evidence of the benefits of this program, and the residents getting to see the residents and just deep community engagement and building trust with them, they went around again and got 15% more respondents saying yes. So they've been around, and they've been planting trees and also creating a highway buffer to create a barrier from the air pollution of a highway that goes right through the study area. Another aspect is the environmental monitoring. We've got our air pollution control district working with them for air quality sensors and also noise monitors, and studying how that massive greening has reduced the noise in the study area. And then there's the medical evaluation. So by the end of this 5-year study, we'll have data from 700 neighborhood participants of their diabetes, heart disease, stress levels, and even their social ties and interactions, and seeing how this that has changed over the course of the 5 years before and after this urban greening. So so this is targeted reforestation that really requires a lot of trust in the community to get their medical data and allow us to plant some trees in their yards. But it's also going to be producing some data that hopefully will be applicable and to many other communities to really demonstrate the wholehearted health and whole life benefits of trees. Next slide. And then one last project that I'll talk about is currently in the works. It's called Parkland Plaza. And this really is a project that came out of the community coming to us and saying that they want a green space in their neighborhood. It's a high heat neighborhood in a historically Black neighborhood. And they said that they want this vacant lot to be a green space. And so Louisville Metro government and many other partners, such as Trees Louisville and Center for Neighborhoods, have really come together to really just find the funding and resources to make this happen. And it's a really exciting project because it's not just going to be sustainable and mitigating our urban heat island effect, but it was really designed by the community. They came together and chose what design elements they want in this park, and really chose everything about it that they want. So so it's really been an exercise in listening to the community and just making what they want happen while implementing sustainability solutions. Next slide. And we are hoping in our Parkland Plaza, in the parking lot of that space, we're hoping to implement a cool paving a parking lot, cool coating on the parking lot, in order to even make the space as cool as possible and really be a refuge from the heat. And we're hoping to do that through the Global Cool Cities Alliance. And we've joined their Cool Roadways Partnership, and that is actually open to any municipality who wants to join. And they're working on ways to innovate in this cool white pavement and on roadways or in parking lots, and really get started in implementation in these light surfaces that increase the albedo effect of a city. So we're working with some partners such as Guard Top that are really innovating and on this coating, and really spurring that implementation and making it happen in pilot projects in numerous cities across the country, and we're going to be one of them. Next slide. And I'll just end on this this equation that we came up with when we were part of the 100 Resilient Cities Network, our Resilient Louisville strategy, took a look at resilience and said, what does it really come down to in the community? And we determined that resilience is equity plus compassion plus trust. So we really are using this to guide our community work and implementing our sustainability solutions. And it's just something that we keep in mind in all of our work. Next slide. And this is my contact information. You can find us at Sustain Louisville on Facebook and Twitter. And you can give me an email if you have any questions later, but I'm also happy to answer questions right now.
Great, thank you so much, Julie, and to you also, Dan. Phenomenal presentations, just both from the science side and the solution side. And Julie, I've heard so much about Green Heart program. One of our colleagues, Jeff Wilson, up here in the Department of Geography at IUPUI, and Dan's colleague I think is an advisor for the program, but and I knew Gil Liu, I think, was involved with it at one point. Anyway, phenomenal stuff, great stuff. Julie, I'm gonna start with a few questions, but then please, the participants, feel free to drop some in the chat. So Julie, you noted one obstacle to this intervention, right? This green intervention. That's just distrust of government in some of these communities, which is for various longstanding reasons that you eloquently described. Were there any other obstacles that you found? And also, is there a way, is a sustainability plan been built into tree maintenance? You know, that's a challenge, right, that we have up here with Keep Indianapolis Beautiful is, you know, they plant a lot of trees, but how do you keep them alive and thriving? So. Yeah,
great questions. Yes, we've encountered, absolutely. The trust in government is an issue that many local governments face, I think, and especially just because many communities and local governments don't really have the capacity for some deep community engagement, which is why we really rely on our partners and especially our local nonprofits that really do go out there and work with the community every day. And so we've found that to be extremely helpful. Louisville Grows for the Green Heart Project is the main implementer of the greening of the planting of the trees and shrubs, and they really do deep community engagement. They knock on every resident's door. They go to events and talk to neighborhood associations, and they really help to build up that trust. And being as separate from the government, they really create a partnership with the neighborhoods that they work in. And they also, in terms of tree maintenance, that's also a concern of ours and of theirs. And we realize that that's going to be crucial. The study it takes place over 5 years, so of course it's important that all the trees that we plant now have to be alive and thriving by the end of the 5 years, or else we're not going to be getting a real clear picture of that data. But then, of course, we want the trees to thrive long after the study is ended. So the Nature Conservancy is one of the larger partners that's provided capacity building to Louisville Grows so that they can continue the tree maintenance as it goes on. And they also have this team of trained volunteers called Citizen Foresters that are trained in how to plant trees properly so that they can lead volunteer groups, and trained in how to maintain trees, and so they can help with that effort as well. And so I also want to say in other barriers, one barrier that we also face that I should mention for other cities is home ownership. And the fact that we are giving these residential plantings, but not everyone who occupies the home is the one who gets to decide what happens on their property. So we chose the neighborhood that we did for the Green Heart Project because it specifically had a large percentage of owner-occupied homes. But in general, for urban forestry and urban greening, that is a barrier that we continue to face, and I don't really have a magic bullet for that.
Oh yeah, that's a common challenge. So thanks for bringing that up. Right, we find the same thing with our environmental analysis up here. Is we have some various citizen science programs, and for some people who are renters don't want to do these tests because if they find something high levels, they feel vulnerable. One of the many vulnerabilities, right? So thank you, and hopefully all your new trees will manage the brood X cicada apocalypse, manage to weather through those. Um, Dan, one of the things that you showed, I think, was the dynamic changes in the city of Indianapolis, for example. I'm sure it happens other places too, through the decades. Do you have any idea of whether some of that change in heat island effect might be related to the emerald ash borer and destruction of some
Yeah.
older tree stands?
Yeah, I think we'll see that in our 2020 analysis that we're doing right now. I mean, as there's been, with some city, there was a city in, I'm trying to think where it was. It was I know it was in Minnesota, but I can't remember the name of it. And it was a smaller one on the scale of maybe like Fort Wayne or something like that, where they lost almost 90% of their tree canopy due to the emerald ash borer. And not only did that add to the heat, but also that helps filter particulates out of the environment. And so they noticed a increase in cardiovascular disease a few years after that event. So I think we're going to see some of that, especially in our latest analysis. I'm not sure it was showing up much in the one I was showing you there, but I think the EAB started maybe there maybe before 2010, maybe 2009 when it first arrived here. I'm trying to remember the exact year, but definitely an impact.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
And the hangover is long, right? Because it takes a long time to replace a mature tree.
Exactly. I've got a small ash tree growing on my property. It's about as big as a pencil right now, and I'm doing everything I can to keep it alive. But I haven't seen an emerald ash borer in a few years. But I've heard they've moved on to some other species too. So I don't know if that's 100% true, but yeah, definitely an impact.
Yeah. So there's also a question dropped in the chat. What data are included in your extreme heat vulnerability index? That's a really interesting.
Well, yeah. So what we've done with that. So there's the land surface temperature over a period of time is included. So there's several satellite variables in that. So the land surface temperature, the amount of vegetation, and then we take a measure from the satellite of the built environment as well. And then there's a variety of about 18 different census variables that you can get from the American Community Survey. And those are there's ages broken down within that. So minority or persons of color, different populations with that. Income, that sort of thing. And then those are all tested against certain health outcomes. So, to see if those, as we put those into a fancy statistical model that kind of infuses everything and gives us an output, and then we test that against, at least for the example I showed you, against extreme heat mortality. And there's a very strong relationship between areas we found being high vulnerability for extreme heat and extreme heat mortality. So I can share a few publications on that model, and we're working on some newer approaches to it as well that will get more of the resiliency sort of things into it rather than vulnerability, because something, and I imagine Julie, you've run into this too, when we talk to these populations, they don't like to hear they're vulnerable, right? It's a negative. You're presenting to them a negative of their community. So if we can use resiliency as a way to show some positives and increasing positives in a community, I think we'll make more headway.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Julie, do you have a comment about that and about reframing the language?
Yeah, that's something that yeah, we've definitely encountered as well, and have really tried to move away from referring to vulnerable communities, and yeah, really looking at their assets and reframing it as a resilience and resilient communities that we're developing, and yeah, as well as referring to them as, you know, bring it back to this historic disinvestment and historically disinvested communities is another language that we've shifted toward.
Great. And there's a couple of questions for you guys in the chat, but maybe we could address offline because we're running almost short on time. But I do want to ask Matthew, I have a question for you. I think largely for you, Julie. How do you prioritize which projects are important to do in terms of sustainability, right? Sustainability is a very broad term.
Yeah, so we have some climate plans, including when it pertains to urban heat. That's really mostly coming from our climate adaptation plan, Prepare Louisville. And so that had a whole host of strategies that we could implement. And going from there, we really are looking at the community and kind of looking what communities' priorities are, different neighborhoods' priorities, and mainly pulling from their neighborhood plans and trying to integrate those together, as well as, of course, we have to have funding for these projects. So just where the funding's coming from, whether it's national funders or from what our Metro Council puts into their budget. So, but that's, yeah, so we really have, we rely on our Prepare Louisville plan and are really trying to implement as much of that as possible.
Great, thank you, Julie. And Dan, if you have a chance, maybe offline to there's Leslie's question there. Yeah,
Yeah, I was just responding to that in the chat. So will that still show up?
Yeah,
If
we'll wrap up in a minute or two. But yeah,
okay.
that was a scorcher.
Yeah.
So I'm going to turn it back over, I think, to Andrea or Beverly for the final housekeeping. I think we're almost at the end of our time.
Yeah, well, I just want to issue a very strong appreciation to Dan and Julie for giving us this presentation today. I think when we launched this webinar series, we really wanted to have someone come in and present and give us some framework for what the issue is, and then someone to come in and show how they're implementing solutions. And that's exactly what we had today. So thank you, Dan and Julie, for taking the time to put presentations together and share your expertise with all of us. This is an incredibly important topic. Temperatures are increasing, and we really need our communities to start paying attention, because as Dan pointed out, this is a silent killer. So thank you all for showing up today, to all of our participants for showing up today. Hope you have a lovely rest of your week, and please stay in touch with the Environmental Resilience Institute if we can help with anything related to heat or other climate adaptation struggles. Thank you so much.
Great.
Thank you all. That's phenomenal.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.